why nobody's playing your indie game and what to do about it. So in this video, I want to show you exactly why it's so hard to get attention when you're a small indie game dev. And then I'll give you 3 simple steps and techniques you can use today to help you start finding players and grow your audience and get wish lists. Hey, my name is Dariusz. Thanks for joining and thanks for subscribing. So here's what you need to know and here's what you need to do. So I call this the indie apocalypse. So the reason it's so hard for you to find players, and grow your audience and get wish lists and, sell your game isn't because the market is oversaturated. Too many game studios making, games is not the problem, right? Actually, if you look at other industries like, movies, books, music, cars, sports, shoes, there are always people making new stuff all the time, every day. And so, every market is oversaturated, right? Again, it's not that there's too many games in the market, why it's so hard to get attention. The real reason why nobody is checking out your game is because of noise. And I call this wasteland of noise that, players have to sift through the indie apocalypse. So the indie apocalypse is basically where, so many game devs are pumping out so much, self-promotion, so much content that it all adds up into one big heap of content that, gamers just basically ignore. Content like GIFs, screenshots, demos, articles, blogs, podcasts, tweets, Instagrams, even ads, whatever, right? You see, it's not the games that's the problem. It's the content that, game devs are, publishing that are, all just ends up in one big pile of noise that the gamer just learned to ignore. Plus, gamers live in a dopamine overloaded world, right? It's so easy for them to compulsively get what they want right now with little effort. And, big game studios know this, right? They specifically design, games, to hijack their brain, overload them with, dopamine rising triggers, and then, get them keep playing for a long time, right? So how does a small indie game, dev or a studio supposed to get, attention, in this indie apocalypse? Well, all of it is not doom and gloom, right? There is a way to get out and there is a way to get attention. So let me explain. Okay, so the first thing you got to know is if a gamer has to struggle through all the noise, they're less likely to find your game and play it. So again, the problem isn't that there's too many games, it's because there's too much noise. The gamer has to, sift through all of the stuff to get the game that they want, right? And they want to play these games, right? The more, choices, the better. But finding a game is now even getting harder and harder because there's so much content. Because you see, gamers will always need to play new games and even old games, right? You don't have to create that desire. It's always there. That desire will always be there to play new games. They will go out of their way to, try to fulfill their need to play new games. So for example, one game will fulfill a gamer's need, right? And then the gamer will get bored and then a new need arises. So they go out actively looking and searching for a new game that will fulfill their new need. Or sometimes they need to fulfill old needs in new ways. So they'll play the same genre over and over again or the same type of game over and over again because they still need to fulfill that old need in a new way. But you probably know this, but there's a paradox when it comes to having too much choice. When there's, too much choice, we often resort to, doing nothing, right? We don't pick anything, or we go back to what we know and not try something new. Again, if a gamer has to struggle in any way, they're going to stop and ignore you. They're going to always take the path of least resistance. And then, they'll go to games that they already know, or they'll play a game that they hear a lot about because, that company or that, studio had a lot of marketing money behind it. Basically, they were able to, use all that money to blast through all the noise. Okay, so what do you do as a small indie game dev that has no marketing money? How do you get, attention in this wasteland of content and self-promotion that, the player is basically ignoring now? So let's keep going and I'll show you how to do this exactly. So in this part, I want to talk about how specificity equals attention. So people want to feel that things are made specifically for them. So let me show you an analogy so that way you can easily understand how specificity means you'll get more attention for your game. So for example, say you're a runner. You're not going to buy an all-in-one shoe that, you can use for work, for basketball, for casual, for walking, and then for running, right? No, you basically want a shoe that's made specifically for running. But then it gets even, more specific because what kind of running? Are you doing long distance running? Are you doing track? Are you doing, ultra marathon? And even within each type of, activity you're doing, it gets even, ridiculously even more specific. So for example, there's running shoes for road only, and there's running shoes for trail running. And then there's, track shoes that have cleats for short distances. And then there's track shoes with, less cleats for long distance running. And then same with ultra marathon shoes, right? There's, marathon shoes for specifically on what kind of, type of terrain you're going to be racing on. Like again, this industry is so oversaturated, but the reason they're able to get attention, some, certain companies is because they eliminate 95% of their buyers and only focus on 5% of those buyers. That's because by making shoes to a specific, buyer is how they cut through all the noise, and that's how they get attention. Again, people want, to feel that things are made specifically for them, and people who do, sports want shoes that are made specifically for whatever activity they're into, right? Okay, so let's bring it back to your indie game. So my whole point is, if you want gamers to play your game, if you want to cut through the noise, then you have to show them through your marketing how your game is made specifically for them. This is how you pique desire. This is how you get your game to stick out in an oversaturated marketplace. And this is how you get your indie game to survive the indie apocalypse. So you got to know who your players are, what they want and what they don't want. And then you got to clearly communicate the benefits of your game and why it's different, so that way a player knows, specifically that it's made for them. Okay, this is all great, but how do you do this exactly? So let's move on to a 3-step technique you can use right now to help you find players. So if you're a small indie game studio and you don't have a big audience, then it'll be really hard to get traction if your marketing message is vague. And that's because if you're vague, then all the content you produce is basically going to sound generic, and it's just going to pile on to that content wasteland that I talked about, and it's going to be ignored by players, right? But if you get specific, and so that your marketing message about your game is understood right away, then you'll start getting traction, because specificity equals attention. So saying that, let's get to work. So I want you to grab a piece of paper and a pen, and then pause the video when you have to, and then write down some notes, because at the end of this 3-step technique, I want you to take action and see how, this will help you gain some traction and help you find players. Okay, so here's step 1, and that is go 4 layers deep when describing your game. So what I mean is, most game devs describe their game as, too shallow. So for example, they'll only go 2 layers deep. So they'll say it's a roguelike, and then what kind of roguelike? Action roguelike, right? And they'll stop right there. But this is like, saying, shoe, and then what kind of shoe? Running shoe, right? You got to be more specific, like what kind of shoe? Like a marathon shoe, but then even more specific, is it going to be road or is it going to be on dirt, trails? And it's the same with your indie game. You got to go 2 layers deeper. So let me show you what I mean as an example. So layer 1 is roguelike, layer 2 is action roguelike, and then you go layer 3 would be top-down shooter, and then layer 4 would be post-apocalyptic. So let me break this down. Let me break down the layers so that you understand what I'm trying to do here, right? So layer 1 is basically your main big genre. Layer 2 is your subgenre. And then layer 3 is your type of combat. So like, top-down shooter, turn-based, third person, first person, what kind of combat is it? And then layer 4 is the setting or the theme. So, post-apocalyptic or cyberpunk or steampunk or fantasy or comic book, right? What kind of theme? So this is very important, because one of the first things a gamer does when hunting for a new game is to judge it first by the subgenre or, the genre, right? Or the description of the game. Then they look for what type of combat mechanics the game is, and then they look for the theme and setting, or, it could be vice versa. But remember, gamers want games made specifically for them. They're going to use your genre and your description of your game as a shortcut to see if the game is made for them. And that's because a gamer isn't going to go play every game for 2 hours and then decide if the game is, made for them, right? What they're going to do is they're going to first judge the genre and the subgenre, and then they're going to read the description, what kind of game it is, the combat and the setting, because they want to use that as a shortcut to know if the game is made for them or not. And this is especially true when a player doesn't know you or ever heard of you. If you can't, rely on your brand name and you don't have any past games that, a player can reference to, then you need to focus on the player and then make it easy for them so they know what's in it for me. So if your marketing message is too vague and you're trying to be mysterious or try to build wonder and curiosity, it won't help you gain traction. And yeah, if you already have a huge audience and people know what to expect from you because, they played your past games, then sure, this doesn't really apply to you, right? But when you're a small indie game dev and you have no audience or a small audience, then you got to play a different marketing game. So narrow your subgenre down into at least 4 layers, because this is how you cut through the noise and get attention. Okay, let's move on to step 2, and that is be specific in your marketing message, so your general marketing message. So you got your genre and your subgenre and your description dialed in, and that's great. But getting your genre and your description done is only the first step. Your next step is you got to show and tell the gamer what your game is. So let me unpack this. So small indie game devs fail to underestimate the power of explaining what their game is. They assume that all a gamer has to do is look at pretty screenshots or GIFs or watch a well-made trailer and the player, will instantly get hooked. But persuading people takes a lot more than that, right? So for example, a track runner might look at a design of a shoe and they might think, it looks pretty. And, looks are always important in getting initial attention, but they don't know if it's made specifically for them yet. They need to be told this. So for example, the marketing will specifically talk about, the traction, the type of spikes the shoe has, or if it's for long distance track or short, or the stability of the shoe, or the type of material, right? The marketing will deliberately talk about who the shoe is made for, but more importantly, it'll talk about how the shoe will make the runner go faster and be more comfortable and be more stable. So what I'm trying to say is that it's the same with your indie game. You need a combination of, shiny images and pretty pixels, but you also need to tell the gamer, what the game is. You need both because a gamer isn't going to put in that much effort. Remember, a gamer isn't going to take the time to figure out your marketing message for you, right? So you got to be specific. You got to tell them, you got to show them what's intuitive to you won't be obvious to them. So it's very important to clearly communicate your marketing message this way. Okay, great. So how exactly do you do this? So the best way I know is to break down your game into 5 tasks. So basically these are your features. So basically tasks are what your player will do in the game. And then for each task, write down and explain how each of that task works. Then after that, come up with at least 3 different actions the player will get to do performing that task. So for example, my roguelike post-apocalyptic top-down shooter game, right? So let me show you how that works. So the task is scavenging, right? So that's what the player gets to do. So then how does scavenging work in this game, right? So the player has to explore the open world and scavenge for materials so that they can upgrade their armor and their weapons. And then I came up with 3 player actions when they're doing this task. So action 1 is fight enemies and collect loot. And then action 2 is go through homes, buildings, caves, stores, and keep an eye out for rare materials when they're doing that. And then action number 3 is use scavenged materials to craft new items. This is important to do because remember, you want to eliminate at least 95% of players and focus on the 5% that will be your target audience, your target market. And like I said before, you can't get attention if you're too generic. Be as specific as you can because that's how you cut through the noise in an overcrowded market. Okay, next, here's step number 3, and that is tell gamers the advantage they'll get for playing your game. So again, let me go back to my, track racer example, right? So say the shoe company talked about the material, the colors, how long it took to design the shoe, and the science in making, the material and making the shoe. And then, you know what? Honestly, so what? The sprinter, the runner doesn't care about that, right? They only care if the material will make them more comfortable, make them go faster, off the block and keep them running fast. And if the shoe will, last for a long time. And that's all they care about, right? They care about the comfort and the speed and the value. And they don't care about, how long it took to design the shoe or how hard the company worked on the science of them, making the material. Again, the customer only cares if the shoe is comfortable, fast, and how long it'll last. And it's the same thing with your indie game. Gamers don't care how your game was made. They only care about if your game will be fun, entertaining, and if it's worth the money. So for example, say you put in 550 hours into developing, a feature. They're not going to care about that, right? But if you show the gamer the benefits, the advantages they get from your hard work, and then you show them that it took a long time because it would make their experience playing the game better or more fun. And then you tell them that this effort you put into this game was because you want the gamer experience to be something new and unique and innovative. And now it's about them, it's about their entertainment, it's about their fun, and it's about, the value of what they're going to get out of your game. So when you're creating marketing material for your indie game, so like stuff like GIFs, blogs, videos, screenshots, even trailers, then ask yourself, so what? And by asking yourself this question, so what, will help you create marketing messages that will show an advantage to the player. And if a player can clearly see that advantage by playing your game, it'll grab their attention and it'll cut through all the noise. And then once you get through all that noise, you're getting one step closer for them to wishlist your game and then to buy your game. All right, so if you want gamers to play your game, then here's your challenge. This will only take about 7 to 10 minutes. So grab a paper and a pen or open up a Google document and then describe your genre to me, right? So for example, if it's an RPG, then what kind of RPG? An action RPG. Okay, great. Then what kind of theme? Say dark fantasy. Okay, great. But then what kind of combat type is it? It's turn-based. So now you have a turn-based dark fantasy action RPG game. And that's perfect because now you're really being specific. So here's the formula again. So you have your main genre, again, RPG. Then you have your subgenre, action. And then you have your combat type, turn-based. And then you have your setting or your theme, dark fantasy. Okay, great. That's your description of your game, right? A short description. Basically, this is like your elevator pitch. So when somebody asks what kind of game you're making, you have basically 4 things you can tell them right away. And then they know instantly what your game is. Okay, next, come up with at least 5 tasks the player will get to do. Then explain how each of those tasks work. Then after that, come up with 3 actions the player will have to take in order to accomplish those tasks. So do this exercise above right now and create your first content using that simple formula. It can be a YouTube video, a TikTok, update your Steam page, a tweet, or a Reddit, or whatever, right? But basically what I want you to do is to take some action right now, and you'll see by, being specific, you will start getting, attention. And I know this isn't easy and this isn't fun and it takes a lot of effort, but when you're starting a business and trying to grow your game studio, there is no quick fixes. There's no life hacks. There's no trying to be efficient, because everybody is so busy trying to figure out how to do hard stuff the easy way. But man, starting a game studio is one of the hardest things you can do. You can't put in the least amount of effort and then expect maximum profits. And I know you're probably already maxed out, right? You're already doing as much as you can. And I'm not saying you need to grind, but you got to, kind of sacrifice some time and put in this effort to figure out how to market your game. So don't just sit there, and learn. You got to take action, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Take small steps and take at least one idea that you learned here and put it into action. And I promise to you that you'll get closer to, to finding customers, to finding players, and growing your audience. And of course, if you're really stuck and you want me to help you find players so that you grow your audience and your wish list, then click the link in the description below. But I highly recommend that you learn this stuff on your own, because starting a business means you need to know how to find customers. And this is one of the biggest skills for you to learn if you want to, be a successful game studio. All right. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Again, my name is Dariusz. Good luck with game dev. See you later. Bye.